We came up with a plan to do this film on Obama. 5 weeks after I put this film out, the FBI was banging on my door. My name is Dinesh D'Souza, and this is my story. I was born in Mumbai, India, then called Bombay. My family was part of the tiny Indian middle class. India is very much of a pyramid. It's got a small group of rich people at the top. It's got a thin sliver of middle class people, and then most people poor. But it's very different than America, which looks more like a diamond. India is about 80% Hindu. That's the majority. About 15% Muslim. Muslims are the main and most influential and maybe the most troublesome minority group. Then there is a sprinkling of smaller groups. The Sikhs, these are the guys who wear the turbans, and the Christians are about 3%. And that was my demographic. My Christianity as a kid was not a very involved Christianity. I have to say it was mostly a social Christianity. My Christian convictions really developed more in adult life. I was in a missionary school, and one day a man from the Rotary Club came and he said, "We have an exchange program." He goes, "No student from this school has ever been on that program." It was a little bit of a wild idea because I'd been alone. It was for a period of a year, but my parents thought that I was kind of a smart kid, but I hadn't sort of seen the world, and so I applied and was selected. I got my first choice, which was America. I got rural Arizona. I was seen as a complete alien. I may as well have come from Mars. But it worked out to my benefit in a very strange way in that my high school counselor came to me one day and he said, "Have you ever considered applying to college in America?" This man shepherded me through the process, and before long I found myself headed to Dartmouth. Really, by the time I got to Dartmouth, I wouldn't say Americanized, I still had an Indian accent, but I was more at home in America than the typical foreign student. And the reason for that was I think that I had lived in American homes, stayed with 4 different families, a rancher, a pastor, a postmaster, and 2 school teachers. And while I was embracing American culture during my first semester at Dartmouth, I caught the intellectual bug, immersed myself in history, political science, philosophy, literature. I sort of fell in with a group of young conservatives, and they had answers to things I didn't even know were questions. They saw themselves as rebels against a liberal establishment. We'd sit around and they'd be discussing like Solzhenitsyn, Hayek, Milton Friedman. We edited a newspaper called the Dartmouth Review. We also did right-wing investigative journalism. In a way, a little bit of a forerunner of Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, because it had that kind of bomb-throwing quality to it. And I found that type of conservatism, adversarial conservatism, quite appealing. So by the time I graduated, I had a little bit of this renegade sensibility that I did not bring to Dartmouth. I worked for a year at Princeton. I then came to Washington, D.C. I worked for about a year at the Heritage Foundation at their magazine called Policy Review. And I was recruited by the White House to join the Reagan administration in '87. And I said, "Well, I can't work at the White House." And they go, "Why not?" And I go, "Well, I'm not a U.S. citizen." They look at each other, and then one guy goes, "Well, are you a Reaganite?" And I go, "Well, yeah." They go, "All right, leave it to us. We'll figure it out." I had multiple occasions in a large room where I would stand in the back of the room, and the senior staff would sit around the table with Reagan. And so I got to see Reagan in action. It showed me some things about his style of leadership, the way he made decisions. You know, a 26-year-old to be in there in the fray was just a wonderful experience. When I was getting ready to leave the White House, the guy who was running the American Enterprise Institute called AEI took me to lunch and he said, "My career advice to you is not to stay in government. People in government don't produce anything. They produce paper. They're bureaucrats." He goes, "Come to AEI and essentially pay you to do whatever you want." And I'm like, well, this sounds pretty good. They paid me a salary and they told me, just do your thing. And I realized that my thing was writing books. And I was there for 11 years. And then I was at the Hoover Institution at Stanford for another 8. So a lot of my career was in these think tanks. Eventually, I moved to San Diego, and while I was there, a fellow named John Sullivan, who is involved in conservative filmmaking, took me to lunch and said, "You need to do a documentary film." But I wasn't interested at the time. I was hired as the president of the King's College, a Christian college in Manhattan, New York. I remember this one time, I did a little stand-up bit that I used pretty spontaneously. This is at the Christmas party. Sure enough, a couple of other faculty members stand up and they give very reverential toasts. And so then it's my turn. I say, I gotta tell you about the real story of Christmas, parts of which did not make their way into the Bible. These people are like, what do you mean? So I was like, well, basically what happened is, Mary and Joseph show up at the inn, and the innkeeper goes, "Can't you see the no vacancy sign?" And Joseph goes, "Can't you see my wife is having a baby?" And the innkeeper goes, "Well, that's not my fault." And Joseph goes, "Well, it's not mine either." So that's the joke. That's the joke. But you have to realize that delivered to that audience, it carries a great deal of shock. Within a couple of months of starting my role at the King's College, this was in the late summer and early fall of 2010, I had been finishing my next book titled The Roots of Obama's Rage. And my idea for it, which came out of reading his book, Dreams from My Father, was the spirit of Barack Obama does not come from America. And after my book was released in late September of that year, a fellow that I knew named Joe Ricketts, who is the founder of Ameritrade, he had read my book. So he goes, "Dinesh, how do we get your message to like 1 million people or 5 million people?" And I go, "Well, the only way I know to do that is to make a film." Joe Ricketts said, "Well, let's do that." So I went back to John Sullivan, and we came up with a plan to do this film on Obama. And I told Joe it would cost about $2.5 million to do it. And so Joe goes, "Well, here's a check for $100,000. Go find 24 other people to give you the same." I was like, how am I going to do that? I went out and I pitched the idea. And I quite honestly think that everybody who invested in that film did not expect to get their money back. But the film turned out to be a big success. It was not a critique of Obama so much as it was a infiltration of Obama's world and his psyche and exposing him as a fraud. 5 weeks after I put this film out, the FBI was banging on my door. The government these days has a massive accordion of federal statutes, and they can pick anybody on the street at random, and if they look at you closely enough, they will find you in violation of one of those things. And in my case, it was that a college friend of mine from my Dartmouth days was running for office, and I exceeded the campaign finance law. I didn't get anything out of it. There was no quid pro quo. I'm not like, if you win, make me a judge, or none of that. And normally that kind of thing gets a small fine, gets a warning, don't do it again, return the money. But in my case, Obama alerted Eric Holder, the then Attorney General of the United States, and was basically like, "Get this guy." After the FBI audited me, I was sentenced by a U.S. district judge in Manhattan, and I had no choice but to plead guilty to get a reduced sentence. For it, the government fined me $30,000, gave me 5 years probation, and made me spend 8 months in a community confinement center, essentially a prison. Later, when I was pardoned by Trump, and I go on with CNN, Anderson Cooper goes, "Well, Dinesh, you were only got your pardon because really powerful people like Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, they got you off the hook." And I go, "Yeah, but the only reason I got on the hook is really powerful people like Barack Obama and Eric Holder set their sights on me. I'm certainly happy to have been vindicated by equally powerful people who decided to undo what those guys did." My first film, Obama's America, opened the door for me to do now 8 or 9 subsequent films. I've made a total of 9 films now. Among them have been Hillary's America, Death of a Nation, 2,000 Mules, and now my latest, The Dragon's Prophecy. I grew up in a middle-class family, and I didn't have great luxuries, but I didn't lack for anything. So if you ask me if my life is materially better in America, it is. But it is not a radical difference. The radical difference is in another area, and that is the idea of the self-directed life. America is not only a country based on birth and blood, it is a country based upon a commitment to certain ideals. I was naturally attracted to that notion of America because I said to myself, I'm an outsider. If I'm going to assimilate to America, I'm going to do it by embracing these ideas. America allows you to chart a course of life for yourself. I've actually played it out. So the idea of having a life in which you are the artist, the idea of being in the driver's seat of your own destiny, freedom allows you to do that. Hey, thanks for watching. To make sure that PragerU can continue to have these videos available for free, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution.